Shall we get going? Who gives me this? Derek, may I start? Good. Good. This is going to be the most important session you go to your whole time in Davos. I can't believe there are empty seats. Those people are missing out, and I think the reason is pretty obvious. I mean, semiconductors drive everything we do. They're in our phones, they're in our watches, they're certainly in our cars and trucks. I just came from the metaverse demonstration that Microsoft and Accenture are doing here. If any of you haven't seen it, I would recommend you go do it because it creates all sorts of possibilities for a very semiconductor intense future. So they've really, increasingly, we come to depend on them for life. Pat Gelsinger has talked about semiconductors as the new oil. Oil's still doing pretty well these days, but conversations here at Davos are clearly about moving away from oil. We are not moving away from semiconductors. They will increase in importance over the course of the next decade and the next two decades. And of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen them play a much bigger role, a much more important role in geopolitics. But we've also seen, and this is where I want to start, I'll introduce the great panel we have in a minute. We've also seen a crazy swing in supply and demand. We went through a year where everybody was talking about this intense shortage of semiconductors, and you couldn't get the car you wanted because the automobile industry wasn't getting the semiconductors it needed. And now we're on the opposite side of that, where there is a glut of semiconductors, too many, and prices are dropping by enormous percentages. And so where I'd like to start is how we got into this mess. We have the perfect panel to discuss all of this. I will introduce them, starting with Martin Lundstedt, who is the CEO of Volvo, makes high-end trucks with how many semiconductors in them now?
Let everyone guess here. I remember in the start of this crisis, people asked me and media asked me, what about the semiconductor in your truck? The reality is that in a diesel-propulsed truck today, it's around 1,750.
1,750.
And now we are in serial production for battery electric vehicles, as you know, both on semi-heavy but also on the heavy duty. There is between 3,500 and 4,000. So it's rather complex value chains, right?
There you go. It will double soon.
And then in addition to that, but we'll talk about that later, the whole connectivity story with charging, etc.
Yeah. Then Liesje Schreinemacher is the Minister of Trade in the Netherlands and has discovered her job is much more about semiconductors than she probably ever imagined.
Had anticipated.
Yeah. And we also have Ashwini Vaishnaw, who is the Minister of Railways, Communication, Electronics, IT. Anything else?
That's enough. Always ask for 3 more hours from God.
For India, and has big aspirations for expanding into the semiconductor business. And then Pat Gelsinger, who is the CEO of Intel. And Pat, I'd like to start with you to explain how the heck this happened. How did we go from this huge shortage to this huge glut in such a short period of time? And doesn't that indicate some sort of a failure on the part of systems?
Well, overall, as you've indicated, Alan, the world is moving more digital, right? Every aspect of human existence becoming more digital. I call it the 5 superpowers. Everything's becoming connected. Everything is becoming a computer, right? We have infrastructure between cloud and edge that allows, essentially everybody can own a supercomputer now in a few seconds, right? You have AI, right, which is making sense of all this data, and finally, we're able to sense everything as well, right? See, hear, all of our digital devices. So literally these superpowers are transforming every aspect of human existence. So you continue to see this demand. Obviously, the semiconductor industry, a fixed cost, long-term, heavy capital industry. If I run a factory full, it costs me X. If I run it empty, it costs me X, right? So how do you run them? Full, right? And COVID created this enormous disruption. Literally, semiconductors for 6 years, right, of shortages in the industry, inventories building, everybody's struggling to catch up. How do I finally, get to it? And then all of a sudden, the economy changes. None of us forecasted, except for maybe Larry Summers, right? This decline in the industry, and all of a sudden, you get hit twice. Yeah. Right, first declining demand, and then second declining inventory position over a 6-year cycle of building up. And all of a sudden now, the industry turns. Now, semiconductor cyclicality is not unusual to the industry because of this long-term fixed cost nature of the industry. So we have ups and downs. Gordon Moore
You've
used to
never
joke,
had ups and downs like that before.
hey, right? It's not, if you look over the history of the industry, we've had pretty radical cycles, before. Gordon Moore, one of our founders, right, Moore's Law, used to joke, we have supply-demand balance exactly 2 moments in time, once on the way up, once on the way down, right? And we're on the way down. Now, that said, everybody, still believes the semiconductor industry doubles this decade. Yeah. Right. And when you think about that, you still need to make these long-term investments. And I, said, I feel like I'm managing, right? I'm driving the car, hitting the brakes, or driving the truck. Sorry, Martin. Right. Hitting the brakes and hitting the gas at the same time, because a 3-quarter economic cycle cannot dictate a 5-year capital cycle. Yeah. Right. So we have to keep making those long-term investments, even as near-term we're struggling through inventories. And the final point is we still have shortages on critical technologies. Wow. Right? Even as we have overall gluts, there's still pieces of the industry that I'm still on allocation for the next year. Isn't it nuts?
So just before we move to Martin, so the glut will cause no reduction in your investment plans?
Well, everybody needs to make some near-term reductions, but my long-term capital build-outs for leadership and capacity stay steady as they goes. We have to stay on the gas, even as some of the capacity adjustments we need to make, to match the near-term economic cycle. But, fundamentally, I got to keep all the strategic investments on track.
So, Martin, you're trying to run a business. You're trying to make these trucks that have 1,700, and I forgot the last 2 digits. I'm sorry, but a lot of
52
semiconductors in them. How do you deal with this wild swing from shortage to glut?
Yeah, but first and foremost, I think we are, to Pat's point also, of course, used to cyclicality. I mean, commercial vehicles, logistics, transportation, by nature is cyclical, so that is built in our business models. We are B2B. That is different to the past car sides, so we have strong relations downstream also with our customers to understand what is happening. We have more than we have almost 2 million connected vehicles and machines around the globe that we're following constantly.
Did you lose sales because of the shortage?
Yeah, everyone did. So we always said that it's an absolute game and it's a relative game. But everyone, so we've had undersupply due to mainly semiconductors and electronics during the last couple of years, but also other factors, because we have seen big imbalances in the whole system. And I think it's coming from the fact that when we were sitting at the end of March 2020 in the group, and we are in 190 countries, really global company. Of course, what do? You stop 85% of your global operations when it comes to industrial footprint, right? You need to continue to serve your customers, societal critical activities.
Just make sure, you closed down 85% of your operations because you could not get the semiconductors.
No, because COVID hit us.
Oh, because COVID hit it, sorry.
And what is happening then, end of March 2020, we say we need to preserve cash flow now. We don't know. We cannot. Broken supply chains directly. You remember how it went. France and Italy closing down, but also in the US, etc. Then we try to define in phase stages. How should we think about initial shock, stop phase, restart, ramp up, new normal? I think the 5 phases came, but they didn't come with the timing and with the magnitude expected. Yeah. And that caused, of course, because the revamp was quicker, more steep, and more brutal. And then some of the industries were even quicker than electronics, consumer, etc. And the transportation industry had these unbalances then, so to speak.
And before I go to Liesje, so then when you look at that, do you say, oh, that was like a once in a century happening and it's never going to happen again, and so we don't have to change our business operations because of that?
No.
Okay.
We have learned a lot. I think the main learnings is not only for you can say, will it happen again, COVID, whatever, but what we have learned together is that the value chain cooperation, not at least also what we will talk about, what we're talking about this week when it comes to the green transformation, is about, connecting completely different for many other reasons as well. Not only with your tier one, but really with the innovators in that specific value chain. So, the relations that we have with the semiconductor innovation leaders today is, of course, around more transparent planning, longer
Longer-term contracts.
more transparent, say this is our latest view on it, what do you think about it, open up for different corridors in that. But even more importantly, regarding the technology roadmaps moving forward. So we know that we are comparing notes both from a competitive standpoint, innovation power, but also actually from capacity alignment, so we understand. Because I think what all of us have learned about semiconductors last year is just amazing.
I've never been so popular.
But it means much closer partnerships between you and you than ever in the past.
Exactly, because and even just one of the little data point, the average car is going from 4 to 5% of the bill of materials as semiconductors. By the end of the decade, it's expected to be 20% because of EV and AV. That's a 4 to 5x increase in the role of semiconductors. You thought the last couple of years were bad? If we don't fix this supply chain and this innovation partnership, how do you ever deliver EV, AV, IVI, these key transformational aspects to the industry? And it's not just in this industry, but it's frankly in every industry.
Now, Liesje, as a trade minister listening to this conversation, I would think my instinct would be, boy, that's chaos. I'm staying out of that. Why do you want to be involved in this?
Well, as a politician, you can never be scared, so you always have to move forward when you see a challenge like this. But as the Netherlands, we are a small country, but a big player when it comes to semiconductors.
Yeah,
and just to emphasize the importance of semiconductors with the challenges we are facing today, when it comes to climate change, for example, we really need it to the sustainable transitions, but also for digitalization. So they are crucial for any and every aspect in our economies, but in our daily lives. Well, you mentioned it, telephones, everything. And so there are a few things that, as a trade minister, I take into account. One is we should never be too dependent on one country or region when it comes to semiconductors and the raw materials.
And just to stop there for a second, the world is right now, what is it, 92% of semiconductors come from one country, Taiwan.
No, not overall. Right.
No,
90% of production capacity of high-end.
Of the high-end chips today.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm fixing that quickly, so.
You and a few other people. We're going to get, Ashwini's working on that too. We're going to get
That is a good friend, so.
And another thing, as a trade minister, obviously, in order to have the value chain still in place, we need open trade. And I know this is under a lot of pressure internationally, but I will be fighting for open trade and prevent protectionism.
Well, wait a minute. Let's talk about open trade. This is an industry that has been subsidized from day one. Now we're seeing subsidies increase across the board. I don't know what the number is, hundreds of billions of dollars being spent by governments to encourage semiconductor industry. Is that your definition of open trade?
That's not my definition of open trade, no. And obviously we are seeing this happening. We have a CHIPS Act in the European Union. There's a CHIPS Act in the US. But I think when it comes to the chips industry, we really need to work together on this. So we have the TTC, for example, the platform where we engage in discussions about this, because it's not only about reshoring when it comes to the production of chips, but also the friendshoring. I think we really need to see where are the shortages, but also, where is the advanced chips production, where is the mature chip production, and just to make sure that we don't just double down on everything and then we have nothing.
But friendshoring is a very different version of free trade than we talked about in these forums 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yes, but so the world is changing, but I don't think that as a European Union or as the Netherlands we can do it just on a national way. So I think the third thing would really be to work together on this, and not only the US and the EU, but also with Korea, with other countries in that region, and also with other countries that could serve as production locations. And
Good. Ashwini, you want in on this. India has a long-term plan to build up the semiconductor business in your country. Why and what are you thinking?
Three things. First is electronics manufacturing, which was practically negligible 10 years back, is today a significantly large industry. $87 billion. This iPhone 14 that you see is made in India. Its supply chain is shifting to the country. Sector after sector, we are getting from import substitution to export-led growth. So telecom equipment, 3 years from now, India will be a large telecom equipment exporter. All the pieces are well set, development is very good. A couple of companies have already started exporting to countries like US. So a very large market which requires semiconductor as the basic raw material, item one. Item two, a very competitive talent pool, good talent pool, about 52,000 semiconductor engineers working in the country. And almost all of them are working from legacy nodes to the cutting edge to the SoC, getting the absolutely new optimization in power consumption, all kind of stuff. The latest and really some of the leading edge technologies our people are working, our talent is working. That as the second factor. Third factor, our university system, which is producing about 500,000 engineers every year. We have tailored our project, our entire plan to make sure that this university system generates a significantly large number of talent, and we have committed to develop 85,000 talent over the next 10 years. And within the 1 year of our announcement of our policy, we announced the policy on 1st January of 2022. By now, we have already tied up with 60 universities. We have changed the course curriculum. So all these factors together make it very natural that India should be the destination for semiconductor.
And how about financing? How much money is the government putting behind this effort?
Government is putting $10 billion. That is just the first tranche. And we fully understand that this is not something which can be done in a quarter or two or a year. This is a long haul. This will require a lot of persistence. This will require lots and lots of effort. And I thank friends like Pat who are guiding us in this journey. And we have listened to the industry. When we announced the scheme on 1st Jan 2022, Pat and many others gave us the inputs that the demand for higher nodes, which go into electric vehicles in Volvo, in the train sets, in practically all the telecom equipment, in power electronics, all those sectors require nodes which are higher nodes. So we changed our policy in October, opened it up further, so very flexible.
No one has said, no one in the Indian government has said, hey, wait a minute, why are we investing these billions of dollars in the middle of a glut?
As Pat very clearly said, this kind of ups and downs have been seen in this industry for quite some time. As Volvo, 4,000 semiconductors in a truck, in an EV. In a train set, that number is close to 12,000. And in train set, we are right on track to become a major exporter in the coming 3 years. So the demand is going to be huge.
You're not worried about that. You have no doubt about
absolutely
the demand.
The Supermine, right? This will take time. Was one of Ashwini's comments. It took us 3 decades to have our supply chains move off of U.S. and EU. Right? There were very active industrial
which
policies.
all of you, by the way, are saying was a big mistake.
Well, to the extreme that we allowed it to occur. Hey, the fact that some of this was put in place, right, some of the trade decisions as well 3 decades ago, hey, we can all second guess those policies now as we're looking back on it. But the fact that over 3 decades we allowed our industry to go from 80% US and Europe to 80% in Asia and become precariously, dependent on very few places in the world, right? To me, that is the core issue that we're out to fix.
But I have to ask you,
it will take decades to fix.
It will take some time. We're 20 minutes into this conversation. No one has mentioned the word China. But clearly, yeah, I do. That's why I'm here. I'm here for that. China is clearly part of what's changed in this equation. Can you talk about that?
Well, overall, they have, China, Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they have been driving their industrial policies in this area. That's why the industry has moved. Right, to Asia at this point.
But at one point, we thought that was okay.
Right, yeah, and we're now 7 5-year plans that China's put in place that have prioritized this industry.
35 years.
Right. So, this is a long, investment cycle on their part. They are the largest, manufacturer now outside of Taiwan, right, is China, right, and they process most of the equipment through China. This has become a huge piece, right? And, there is nothing like disengagement ever possible in the economy because they play a huge role. But at the same time, we're also saying, what is the geographically balanced supply chain need to look like for the world? Europe should be able to say, I can meet my critical industry requirements. So should the Americas. That's what we're out to do, is not, not separation, right? Not disengagement, but a balanced, resilient supply chain. And that, to me, is the singular word we should all be focused on. If I could rename WEF this year, it'd be resilience, not fragmentation.
So you're not taking my bait. It's not China
Absolutely
specific.
Not. Absolutely not.
No, but I think, I mean, just to add to what you say, I mean, we are running businesses. We are used to think about the P&L, the cash flow, and how we translate the cash flow into utilizing it either to dividend it out or to actually build up our balance sheet, right? And how should the balance sheet look like? And I think Europe and US have not spent, from a country perspective or from a region perspective, enough time on thinking through the strategic pieces of their balance sheet. So it's not about protectionism. It's like a company. What should I partner up with? What should I do and understand when it comes to technology innovation? This we have not been doing when it comes to the critical. Take a very practical example now that's also related to semiconductors, 5G rollout. And then we say, we need to have examples of business cases and auctions and bandwidth and blah, blah, blah. When the reality is that the rollout of 5G is a platform for imagination, a platform for innovation. That is a balance sheet piece for future infrastructure. And that is what we need to think about when we think about the critical components of value chains in order to be competitive in innovation in all aspects. So I understand, I think the minister had a very good point when you're talking about what are the critical aspects in the Indian balance sheet. And this is one of those, together with the talent.
Correct.
Yeah.
It's not more difficult than that in reality, and we need to think through what are these critical pieces for the European or North American balance
I'd
sheet.
like to add one more point here. It took 60 years for the semiconductor industry to grow to $550, $600 billion. It's going to be $1 trillion in next 6 years. So that's the kind of growth which is happening in this
It's going to
industry.
double in 6 years.
Yeah.
By the end of 2030, 1 trillion we cross is the expectation of most analysts at this point.
So there's enough for everybody.
Are you
Yeah.
confident?
Well,
Netherlands
can I-
is small.
Well, we do need a lot of chips. But can I throw another, piece of red meat
Sure,
in the
I
arena?
love red meat.
And it's because I'm now also here with businesses, and that is one of we are talking about supply and demand, but I think that when it comes to supply, one of the critical issues will be raw materials and the critical raw materials, and where do we get them? Because we are talking about now production locations, but also just the lithium that we need for our batteries and other materials that we need for our semiconductors. And where do we? Well, I'm sitting next to someone from Sweden, so maybe
You're
I
going to
think
solve it on the ocean floor?
yeah, you stumbled upon some critical raw materials, I believe.
Absolutely. I was actually up with the Commission on Friday,
Okay.
looking at the mine there. So.
Well, look, and so I think that is also something that I want to ask businesses, how do they see the role of governments? Because businesses will have to identify which one. We are working on a Raw Materials Act in the European Union. We have done it nationally in the Netherlands. And where do you see a role of governments in
Well,
this?
Pat, I'll bet you
Because-
spend most of your
yeah.
time these days with government officials. Give me an estimate.
Well, a fair amount, right, in getting U.S. and EU CHIPS Act done, been very active. But I'd also, have us, make sure we think about supply chains, not about any one topic. Right, because even there, the minerals are not the issue in most cases. It's actually the refining of the minerals, right, and where that is. It's actually fairly easy to move the minerals, the refineries, right, and obviously U.S., our regulatories around environmental and so on. Hey, maybe we're not going to fix it. It's fixing the supply chains that come into it, right, and as we look at where semiconductors are built now, hey, it's also the packaging, assembly, test. It's also then the systems and the, sheet metal bending that goes in, and where the power supply is built, the displays, the LCDs, and so on. Has to be across the supply chain. And my advice to government is make sure we're looking across the supply chain and fixing one by one every one of the critical factors that give you the assurance of supply that you need for your critical industries over the long term.
No, and not just at one point.
Not just one thing.
And
Yeah.
okay, thank you. So another piece would be green manufacturing. semiconductor manufacturing will become will also be affected by the green discourse we have everywhere. So we in India are very clear that whatever new plants, new fabs that we set up will be served with green energy, will be serviced by green energy. We already have 42% of our energy from green sources, from renewable sources, and we do want to add that advantage to the semiconductor manufacturing also.
No, but I think what is linked to the experience we've had now with the semiconductor crisis is the Andrea, who is our Chief Procurement Officer, she said, I've changed title now, it's Chief Partnership Officer. Chief Partnership Officer, CPO. No, but because the reality is that, to Minister's point here, we are, of course, going to the source, both of the innovation power and the capacity power for sustainable solutions. So, I mean, we are partnering up with the mining companies together, and thereby also pulling our Tier 1 and Tier 2s to work together with both us, because we cannot do it alone. And that the power of Scope 3 also in the green transition will be fabulous here, because, I mean, what is my Scope 3 is someone else's Scope 1 or 2.
Yeah.
So also what we learn now, going from spot market to long-term agreements, both on innovation, technical roadmaps and capacity, innovating together, not as OEMs handing over the RFQ, the request for quotation, transactional business, answer this, don't come up with any own ideas, please.
Yeah.
Give me a low price, into saying, we need your help. We need your innovation.
Yeah.
We need your fantasy and imagination.
This
is a big shift.
And I want to open the conversation up a little bit to the audience. I mean, this is a huge change in the way we talk about globalization. I've been involved in these conversations for, I don't know, 45 years. And we have, by the way, we have Governor Gretchen Whitmer from Michigan here. I'm going to make you speak for the United States in a minute. I may get Senator Portman in on it,
Yeah, we
too.
also have Senator Cantwell behind you there as well.
Oh, good. We have a quorum. I'm sorry. So many of you are behind me.
Good.
I can't see, but I really do want to open it up, because I've been in these conversations for 45 years, and for most of that time, it was the United States attacking other countries for subsidizing critical industries. And if you mentioned, industrial policy, whether it was Japan or Europe or China, the political responses in the U.S. was, we're not going to get our hands dirty. We're not going to pick winners and losers. We're not going to subsidize. And now all of a sudden, you come to Davos, and we have the CHIPS Act, massive subsidies for chip production in the United States.
Competitive investments.
Massive competitive investments in the United States. There's been more talk about the badly named Inflation Reduction Act over the last 3 days than there was in the U.S. at the time, and the subsidies. Are you sure we're doing the right thing? This is a huge lurch from the historic position of the U.S. government.
Yes. I'll expand. No, I think it's important to remember that this industry largely began in the United States, and it didn't just get up and leave. It was lured, and it was courted, and it was incentivized. And I've heard so many people here say, we're so glad the United States is back in the game and committed to climate action, and also criticism that these incentives are unhelpful to other countries. But as you think about what is happening around the globe, it is healthy for all of the world that the United States is active, is producing chips. Think about one of our incumbent businesses, General Motors. They buy chips from around the world. They need to have chips in the United States as well. These are global issues. It is a national security issue, and I know Senators Cantwell or Portman will add, I'm sure, if called upon. But I can also tell you from the local perspective, it's about good jobs as well. In Michigan, we're really proud of our auto industry that is moving fast and transitioning quickly. We're also proud to have, for a long time, been a provider of some of the purest polysilicon in the world at Hemlock Semiconductor. We've been doing a lot of this work. Now that the world knows why it's so important, we're excited about what the opportunities
So no second
ahead.
thoughts.
Not from my perspective.
I want to put Senator Portman on the spot, because you've been involved in these conversations as long as I have, and you have been a staunch defender of free trade when it meant something different than it means when Liesje just says it. So how do you view what's happening here?
I noticed earlier when Pat was talking about trade agreements, he pointed at me. Sorry about that. No, I mean, look, I have a little different view. I think it's about balanced trade, and it's about free trade, but fair trade. And so you're right, there's no free market in semiconductors, unfortunately, and that has been true.
Probably never has been.
And I was about to say that has been true since the start, I'm sure. But if you look at the subsidies that other countries have provided, and you look at what happened during the pandemic when we all became more keenly aware of the supply chain issues, you mentioned resiliency. I would say reliability as a national security matter and an economic security matter all came to the fore. I mean, here you had cars on lots in Ohio, just waiting for their semiconductor. And, we have a lot of semiconductors in our military. And you mentioned, Alan, that 90% of the high-end semiconductors that are used in things like F-35s are made in one country, where there's a lot of vulnerabilities right now. So I think it's a national security issue, economic security issue, but a recognition that although we might all like to have a free market in some of these essential products like semiconductors, it does not exist, and it didn't. And so that's why we need to do things. One other thing quickly that has been missed in the CHIPS Act, a lot of this is not about specific subsidies to specific companies, it's about research. And it's about fundamental research. And Maria can talk more about this than anybody because she was very involved in this over time, but like the National Science Foundation funding, which is critically important for our future in terms of the investments in basic science that the United States is now making.
Yeah.
And just if I could, right?
Yeah, go ahead.
These are two of the heroes of getting the CHIPS Act done. Senators Cantwell and Senator Portman, huge to get it across the line because any major piece of legislation, hard to get done. And these are two of the people that made it happen. It's
Senator
my
Cantwell,
heroes.
do you want to continue the love fest?
I would just say, I think there's three big issues here that I don't know that we're honing in on. And the first one is how incredibly expensive it is to build fabrication facilities. So when you look at the issue that chips have now become an essential component in the information age of just about everything, you have to ask yourself, I mean, would we do the same thing for a bread shortage, for wheat or something of that nature? So it has become that essential in our day-to-day lives. So when the shortage is and the demand, people start saying, well, how are these companies going to fund these $20 billion facilities in various places? And so I think that made the allure of helping to make it cheaper. So now you also have a pandemic, which brings home the point of if you can't get this supply, what does it mean? And certainly, what does it mean to national security?
Yeah.
And it all of a sudden, so I think what you've all discussed is there is now going to be, for the future, enough demand that we all can get in the game. And that is what we're going to obviously reap the benefits from, an automobile industry that basically can have the kind of driverless cars, but is going to take an immense capacity. Absolutely. So really, Rob Portman and I and many other people will come back to this issue about the trade angle on this. But at this moment, it's an essential, critical element to every single economy. We don't have enough production, and we all are going to figure out how to help this production for the future.
Yeah. So we don't have anyone sitting on this stage from Taiwan, Korea, China. There may be some people behind me, but I don't have eyes in the back of my head. If there's somebody back there who wants to take the microphone and... Taiwan? But you're talking about a major shift. Is there anyone else who wants to get in on this conversation? Yes, go ahead. Oh, completely separate topic, you say. You're not going to take my bait. That's all right. I'm used to people answering questions other than the one I ask.
Been a lovely conversation, thanks. Liesje Schreinemacher from Philips, MedTech, mainly using mature chips. Now, you've talked about the advanced chips and that we need to diversify and there's that challenge. But Intel said, look, we need to look at the supply chain as a whole and identify the bottlenecks and solve them. We didn't really talk about mature chips. Now, there's massive issues there. You started out saying we're still on allocation in a lot of those areas. How do we address the challenges of the mature chips, which are important for industrial goods, for medical equipment? Some of those are life-saving, life and death. I would say that's a very critical issue. It'd be interesting to hear your perspective.
Yeah, and maybe just a quick view of this. Right, in some cases, it's easier to redesign the chip to a more modern node than it is to build a 4-year factory investment to build a process technology that is already 20 years old. Right, the economics of making new capital investments in very old nodes, right, is a very difficult thing. So we've worked with a lot of customers to help them accelerate move to more modern nodes, right? And by the way, as you do that, it actually frees up more of the old capacity for some of those chips that are much harder to move as well. But this is where I say deep conversations with the customers in the supply chain, and we're putting now in place multi-decade supply agreements with our customers, right? Saying how do we take care of you for decades to come, because this is such a harrowing experience.
Yeah.
The fact that for literally for $2 components we're stopping billion-dollar projects, how untenable that is for the global economy.
And I assume you're using both. You're using high-end and low-end.
Absolutely, and to Pat's point, also during this crisis, has been both about, so to speak, working closely together on finding the right type of capacity short term, but also to redesign a lot. So we have spent a lot of hours understanding how can we redesign and move this short term, but more importantly long term. And again, understanding where is the landscape moving. So if we look at the American Chips Act, that we are equally big, I mean, in US as we are in Europe. 20% of the Chips Act there is dedicated to the mature chips, right?
Yeah.
Which is an important point. In Europe, everything is dedicated to the advanced chips, which is a risk, by the way, because for automotive and industrial sectors, less than 5% of all the chips that are used are actually the advanced nodes. So we need to understand that constitution. It's both a capacity game, right, and an innovation game, and we need to cope with both. But again, it comes to understanding and how should we actually utilize the technology as it is for these different verticals, right?
We have actually addressed that in our policy. That's a very valid point. Close to half the total demand is from the mature nodes. So, so in our case, in the case of India, our entire policy supports mature nodes as well as advanced. We think we'll start with the mature nodes. And there is another innovation which is happening, and which is where the design capabilities really come to play, as Pat said. For example, in a car, if there are like 200 chips going in, wouldn't it be more economical to design a system which has probably 3 or 4 chips, which is able to make sure that the glass goes up and down on time, make sure that the speed governor is properly in place. So that kind of innovation is also going to come, Pat, if you would like to add on.
Fully agree.
Yeah, there's definitely a re-architecting now, because a lot of what happened in the automotive industry, but also some of the other industrial industries, they're tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 suppliers. They didn't even know what chips were in there. And all of a sudden, it's sort of like, what do you mean we don't have semiconductor supply? But they didn't even have visibility through the supply chain because it had been sedimented, right, through these sub-suppliers as well. And that's where, the intimacy of understanding the criticality of supply. I believe, governments need to do that in supply chains, but also, right, customers need to do it, right? Because, if you don't know where those core technologies are, how do you actually form policies to manage them?
And that is where new kind of innovations which come. For example, I wouldn't be surprised if in 3 years from now, we see a car operating system, automobile operating system, which basically makes sure that all the chips manufactured by different people for different functions, they are basically able to speak to each other in a very seamless way. So those kind of innovations are also part of the semiconductor.
We're doing that.
I should say that we are already in there, and for the more advanced nodes when it comes to battery and fuel cell electric, but also when it comes to the autonomous verticals, right, on the commercial side. But having said that, I think it's also good to make a white book. Was it really a shortage? Or was all the chips allocated in the wrong places also? Because we have seen so many inventories sitting around. Coming back to Ohio, a lot of cars or trucks or equipment, wherever, sitting on parking places with a lot of chips into them. So that is another important issue to address. More transparency will give also better options to really redistribute.
Yeah, how do you fix that problem? Because if you have more distributed production, planning becomes more complicated, not simpler. So how do you fix the fact, how do you make sure that people are making what you need?
Let's start to share what you know yourself, or what are your views. Again, we are not utilizing the technology exists, the platform economy, to really make sure that everyone, to Pat's point, in the value chain is actually sharing the same type of information. It's a whispering game. And with
so
the
how do you-
whispering
how do you
game,
make
the
it-
tail is getting, bigger and bigger, and at the end of the day, so
How do you make it transparent?
share the information. I mean, as we do, we share on LinkedIn, we share everything, and everyone can read it. So we can share with a number of tier 1 suppliers.
And you might recall the first thing that Commerce did, right, in the CHIPS Act was in fact supply chain transparency.
Yeah.
Right, where they started to put policies in place to start getting those things available, right, so that people could start looking at it. I'd also say this to me is a little bit where free market kind of behavior. Distribution channels are generally pretty efficient, right, at that level. And it's an area where, hey, a little bit of transparency. But the other factor is, and this is where I see a lot of this going in the future, is we're moving from chips to chiplets and composites, where we need to drive more standardization, right? And the standardization of how the things are put together, how we can go from thousands of chips to hundreds of chips, right? That have standardized interfaces in it, more interplay between the different components. I expect there'll be some meaningful announcements in this area specifically for the auto industry this year.
We are just about out of time. I want to go around the panel one last time and ask you, what's the one thing that people are missing in this very intense debate? What's the one thing that you would like people to sort of take away from this session to remember about what's going on?
No, I think it's a lot of things, but mainly that this is here to stay the growth of, semiconductors related to everything that will be digitalized in order to really deliver what we want to do for the planet, for society, to be competitive, etc., in our different verticals. And therefore, I think we should look strategically upon that, both from a company perspective, country perspective, and really work together to utilize the innovation power into this.
Liesje.
Well, you said it very well, and I believe that many things were mentioned that are very important. I think that the dependencies on one region, one country, should really be minimized, and I think that the transparency of value chain, when it comes to value chain shocks and encountering them, is really important, and also for governments to step up and help companies or allow companies to trade with different countries to make sure that that they keep access to raw materials, but also different parts of the value chain.
Ashwini.
I think trusted long-term partnerships would be a very important factor in success going forward, in terms of supply chain resilience, in terms of innovations in products that we bring in terms of what do you do when things go wrong in some part of the world? Can you really rely? So in those things, in all those matters, trusted long-term agreements would be very, very critical.
I think collaboration is the theme of this year's Davos. You got it right this time. Way to go, Derek. Yeah, that's. Go ahead, Pat.
You're right. The famous statement: democracy does the right thing always after it's exhausted all other possibilities. Right? And here we needed a global crisis to realize that we had allowed ourselves to become acutely dependent on single points of failure in the supply chain, on critical aspects that's underlying all aspects of humanity. The simple word is, we need resilient supply chains for the future without single points of failure. That's what we need to be building, and that's the core lesson that we need to have taken through, right, this economic, technological supply chain shock that we've gone through.
Great. Pat, Ashwini, Liesje, Martin, thank you so much. Thank the rest of you for participating.
Congratulations. Yeah.